When the elderly man walked through the back door of the courtroom, he was living through one of the hardest moments of his 79-year life. His bony shoulders protruding from under his torn military jacket revealed he hadn't eaten in days. His hands were shaking, not from age but from cold and hunger. His hair was dirty and disheveled, his beard had grown long, his shoes were full of holes. Everyone in the courtroom saw the same thing: a typical homeless man, probably with alcohol or drug problems, maybe even someone who had already lost his mind. While lawyers shuffled through their files, the court clerk checked records with a bored expression, and spectators looked at their phones. Nobody knew who this man really was. Even Judge Patricia Williams saw him as just another vagrant case. But when his name was called, Colonel James Morrison, Williams's heart stopped, because this name wasn't just written in military records, but in her own family history. This was the Medal of Honor recipient who had gone missing in Vietnam 40 years ago, the hero her father, General Williams, had searched for but never found. Officially listed as dead, in reality, standing before her accused of theft, this broken man carried one of America's greatest secrets. And today, that secret would be revealed. The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of Riverside County Courthouse as another day of routine cases began. Judge Patricia Williams had been presiding over this courtroom for 15 years, and she thought she had seen everything. Drug possession cases, petty theft, domestic disputes, the endless cycle of human mistakes and misfortune that filled her docket day after day. But today would be different. Today, history would walk through her courtroom door disguised as just another forgotten man. James Morrison had been awake since 4 a.m., not by choice, but because the cold concrete under the 3rd Street Bridge made sleep impossible. At 79, his body couldn't handle the hardness anymore. Every joint ached, every breath was a reminder of lungs scarred by Agent Orange and decades of living rough. He wore the same clothes he had worn for the past week, a tattered military surplus jacket that had once been olive green but had faded to an indeterminate brown, jeans with holes at both knees, and boots that had seen better decades. The theft charge was bullshit, and James knew it. He had been standing outside Walmart, hoping someone might spare some change, when security accused him of stealing a candy bar. He hadn't stolen anything, hadn't even gone inside the store. But who was going to believe a homeless old man over store security? The system had already written him off as worthless, invisible, disposable. The courthouse hallways smelled of industrial cleaner and old coffee. James shuffled along behind the bailiff, his arthritic hands shackled in front of him, a humiliation that cut deeper than the cold or hunger. At his age, after everything he had been through, to be treated like a common criminal felt like the final insult from a country he had served with distinction. In the courtroom, morning light filtered through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like memory. Judge Williams took her seat behind the bench, coffee in hand, reviewing the day's cases. Another shoplifting case, another homeless defendant, another quick plea and sentencing. She had learned not to get emotionally involved in these cases. They were too depressing, too hopeless. But something made her look up as James entered the courtroom. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, even bent over and frail. Maybe it was something in his eyes that didn't match his circumstances. Or maybe it was just intuition, honed by years of reading people from the bench. James took his seat at the defendant's table next to his public defender, a young woman named Lisa Chen, who had been assigned his case that morning. She had glanced at the file. James Morrison, 79, homeless, theft charge. Probably another quick plea deal. She hadn't bothered to dig deeper into his background. There wasn't time, and frankly there rarely seemed to be much point with cases like this. The courtroom was sparsely populated, a few other defendants waiting their turn, a police officer who had made the arrest, some law students observing from the gallery. Nobody important, nobody who mattered. Just the usual collection of people who found themselves on the wrong side of the law on a Tuesday morning. The court will now hear the case of the People versus James Morrison, announced the clerk, reading from her docket. James stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement. Judge Williams looked at him properly for the first time, taking in his appearance. Homeless, clearly probably mentally ill. Definitely a veteran, judging by the jacket and the way he stood despite everything. She had seen thousands like him over the years. Men broken by war, forgotten by the system, living on the margins until they ended up in her courtroom. But something nagged at her as she looked at this particular man. Something familiar about the name, about his bearing, about the dignity he maintained even in his current circumstances. "Mr. Morrison," she began, "you are charged with theft of merchandise valued at under $50. How do you plead?" James looked directly at her for the first time. His eyes, though tired and weathered, were clear and intelligent. "Not guilty, Your Honor." His voice was stronger than his appearance suggested, with the kind of commanding tone that spoke of a man who had once been listened to, respected, followed. Judge Williams felt that nagging sensation grow stronger. "Your Honor," interrupted Prosecutor Davis, a young attorney eager to move through his caseload. The defendant was observed by security personnel, but Judge Williams wasn't listening to the prosecutor anymore. She was staring at James Morrison, searching her memory. That name, that bearing, something from her father's stories, from old family conversations about Vietnam, about heroes lost and found. And then it hit her, like a physical blow. James Morrison, Colonel James Morrison, the Medal of Honor recipient her father had searched for in Vietnam, the man who had single-handedly held off an entire North Vietnamese company while his unit evacuated wounded soldiers, the soldier who had been reported missing in action, presumed dead, whose body was never recovered. Her father, General Robert Williams, had spent years trying to find Morrison, had carried the guilt of leaving him behind until the day he died, and now, impossibly, that man was standing in her courtroom, accused of stealing a candy bar. Judge Williams's hands began to tremble. She set down her coffee cup with a soft clink that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet courtroom. Everyone sensed that something had changed, though they couldn't understand what. "Mr. Morrison," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, "what is your full name?" The prosecutor looked confused. "Your Honor, that information is in the file. I want to hear it from him," Williams said firmly, never taking her eyes off James. James straightened slightly, and for just a moment, the courtroom could see the soldier he had once been. Colonel James Robert Morrison, United States Army, retired. The title hung in the air like a revelation. Judge Williams felt her eyes fill with tears. "Let me pause here and tell you why this moment was so extraordinary. Judge Patricia Williams wasn't just any federal judge. She was the daughter of General Robert Williams, a Vietnam veteran who had spent decades carrying the weight of soldiers left behind. Her father had told her countless stories about the men who didn't make it home, about the heroes whose sacrifices were never properly recognized. And at the top of that list was always Colonel James Morrison, the man who had saved her father's unit and vanished into the jungle. For 40 years her family had wondered what had happened to Morrison. For 40 years they had honored his memory at every Veterans Day dinner, raised toasts to the man who had given everything so others could live. And now, here he was, standing in her courtroom like a ghost made flesh. "Bailiff," Judge Williams said, her voice shaking, "please remove the defendant's restraints." "Your Honor?" The bailiff looked confused. "Remove them. Now." As the handcuffs were unlocked, James rubbed his wrists and looked up at the judge with growing recognition. He had seen that look before, the way people's expressions changed when they realized who he was, what he had done, what he had lost. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Williams continued, "would you please tell the court about your military service?" The prosecutor started to object, but Williams silenced him with a look. James stood a little straighter. "I served 3 tours in Vietnam, Your Honor. I was commanding officer of Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry. I was awarded the Medal of Honor for actions at Landing Zone Albany in 1965. The courtroom was dead silent now. Even the law students had stopped taking notes, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Judge Williams stood up slowly, and as she did, something extraordinary began to happen. The bailiff, recognizing what was occurring, came to attention. The court reporter, whose grandfather had served in Vietnam, stopped typing and stood. One by one, everyone in the courtroom began to rise. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Williams announced, her voice carrying throughout the room, "you are in the presence of a Medal of Honor recipient. Colonel Morrison is one of only 258 living recipients of our nation's highest military decoration." The silence that followed was profound, sacred. James Morrison, who had been dismissed as a homeless vagrant just minutes before, was now revealed as what he truly was, an American hero. But Judge Williams wasn't finished. "Colonel Morrison, my father was General Robert Williams. He served with you in Vietnam. He spoke of you often, of your courage, your sacrifice, your leadership. He searched for you for years after you were reported missing." James's composure finally cracked. Tears began streaming down his weathered face. "Bobby Williams was your father? Little Bobby from Texas?" "Yes," Williams whispered. "He never stopped looking for you. He never stopped believing you were out there somewhere." The emotional weight of the moment was overwhelming everyone in the courtroom. Here was a reunion across decades, across the vast gulf between the living and those presumed dead. James Morrison had been a ghost for 40 years, and now he was being called back to life by the daughter of his old comrade. "Your Honor," James said, his voice breaking, "I tried to come home. I tried for years. But when I finally made it out of that jungle, when I finally got back to the world, nobody knew who I was anymore. My records were lost, my unit had been disbanded, my family thought I was dead. I had nothing to prove who I was, what I had done. I became just another crazy veteran telling war stories no one wanted to hear." The tragedy of it hit everyone in the room. This wasn't just about a homeless man accused of petty theft. This was about a system that had failed one of its greatest heroes, about bureaucracy that had erased a man's identity, about a country that had forgotten the very people who had sacrificed everything to protect it. Judge Williams wiped tears from her eyes. "Colonel Morrison, this court owes you an apology. This entire system owes you an apology. You should have been welcomed home as a hero. Instead, you've been living on the streets, treated as a criminal." She turned to the prosecutor. "Miss Davis, I assume you'll be dismissing all charges against Colonel Morrison?" The prosecutor nodded quickly. "Yes, Your Honor." Immediately. But Judge Williams wasn't done. She had spent her entire legal career trying to honor her father's memory, trying to ensure that justice was served fairly and with compassion. And now she had the opportunity to do something that would have made General Williams proud. "Colonel Morrison, this court recognizes not only your innocence of these charges, but your extraordinary service to our nation. Bailiff, please ensure that Colonel Morrison has transportation to wherever he needs to go, and please contact the Veterans Administration. I want them to know that Colonel Morrison is alive and needs immediate assistance with housing, medical care, and benefits." The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause. The law students were on their feet, clapping enthusiastic. The police officer who had made the arrest looked ashamed. The other defendants, most of whom had served time themselves, understood they were witnessing something special. James Morrison, who had entered the courtroom as a forgotten man, was leaving as a recognized hero. But the story was far from over. Within hours of the hearing, word had spread throughout the legal and military communities. Judge Williams personally called the Pentagon, the Veterans Administration, and several military historical societies. By evening, reporters were calling, veterans organizations were mobilizing, and the story was beginning to go viral on social media. Colonel Morrison was taken to the VA hospital, where doctors marveled at his survival. 40 years of living rough had taken a tremendous toll on his body, but his spirit remained unbroken. Agent Orange exposure had caused respiratory problems. Untreated injuries from Vietnam still caused him pain, and malnutrition had weakened him considerably. But he was alive, he was home, and finally, he was being treated with the respect he deserved. The next day, Judge Williams visited him at the hospital. She brought with her a box of her father's military papers, including letters General Williams had written but never sent. Letters addressed to Colonel Morrison, thanking him for his service, apologizing for leaving him behind, hoping against hope that he was still alive somewhere. "He never forgave himself for not finding you," she told James as he read through the letters with trembling hands. "He died thinking he had failed you." "He didn't fail anyone," James replied. "He was a good soldier and a good man. I'm just sorry I never got to tell him that." The reunion that never happened in life was finally taking place through death, through memory, through the enduring bonds of military brotherhood that transcend time and circumstance. The story of Colonel Morrison's return from the dead captured the nation's imagination. Veterans groups raised funds for his care. Military historians rushed to interview him about his experiences. Politicians posed for photos with him, suddenly eager to be associated with a genuine American hero. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from the men he had served with, the soldiers whose lives he had saved at Landing Zone Albany. Several of them, now elderly men themselves, traveled from across the country to see their old commander. The reunion at the VA hospital was emotional beyond description, as grown men wept openly at seeing their leader again after 4 decades. "We thought you were dead, sir," said Tom Rodriguez, who had been a young private in Morrison's company. "We had a memorial service for you and everything." "I'm harder to kill than I look," James replied with a smile that transformed his weathered face. The Medal of Honor Society formally welcomed Colonel Morrison back into their ranks, organizing a ceremony to present him with a replacement medal. His original had been lost somewhere in the Vietnamese jungle decades earlier. The ceremony, held at the Pentagon, was attended by hundreds of military personnel, government officials, and members of the media. But for James Morrison, the most important moment came when Judge Williams presented him with the flag that had covered her father's casket, along with a letter General Williams had written shortly before his death. "My dear friend Jim," the letter read, "if you are reading this, then you have finally made it home. I never stopped believing you were out there. I never stopped hoping we would meet again. I carry the guilt of leaving you behind, but I carry the pride of serving with you even more. Welcome home, brother. Welcome home." 6 months after that day in the courtroom, Colonel Morrison was living in a VA facility designed specifically for elderly veterans. He had his own room, regular meals, medical care, and most importantly, the recognition and respect he had earned through his service. He spent his days talking with other veterans, sharing stories, providing the kind of leadership and mentorship that had made him legendary in Vietnam. Judge Williams visited him regularly, and they had become close friends. She often brought her own children to meet him, wanting them to understand what real heroism looked like. Not the Hollywood version with explosions and dramatic speeches, but the quiet kind that involves doing what's right, even when nobody is watching, even when the cost is everything you have. The courthouse where Colonel Morrison had been tried for petty theft now had a plaque in the lobby, honoring him and all veterans who had been failed by the system they had sworn to protect. Judge Williams had championed the installation of the plaque, wanting to ensure that future generations would remember not just Morrison's heroism, but the lesson of his long journey home. The inscription read, "In honor of Colonel James Morrison, Medal of Honor recipient, and all veterans who served with distinction and returned to a nation that had forgotten their sacrifice. May we do better by those who do better by us." Colonel Morrison lived for 3 more years after that day in court, surrounded by friends, respected by his community, and finally at peace. When he passed away quietly in his sleep at the age of 82, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including active-duty military personnel, veterans from multiple wars, government officials, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by his story. Judge Williams delivered the eulogy, speaking not just about Morrison's military service, but about his dignity in the face of abandonment, his perseverance through decades of hardship, and his forgiveness toward a system that had failed him so completely. "Colonel Morrison taught us that heroism isn't just about what you do in moments of crisis," she said. "It's about who you remain when everything is taken from you. It's about maintaining your humanity when the world treats you as less than human. It's about never giving up on the belief that truth and justice will eventually prevail." The story of Colonel James Morrison became a catalyst for reform in how the military and veterans services handle missing personnel and veterans' benefits. New protocols were established to prevent cases from falling through bureaucratic cracks. Better systems were put in place to verify veterans' identities and service records. Support programs were expanded to help homeless veterans navigate the complex process of obtaining the benefits they had earned. But perhaps most importantly, Morrison's story became a reminder of the humanity that exists in every person, regardless of their circumstances. The homeless man dismissed as a vagrant turned out to be a Medal of Honor recipient. The crazy old veteran telling stories no one wanted to hear turned out to be telling the truth about extraordinary service and sacrifice. Judge Williams often reflected on that day in her courtroom, on the moment when she realized who James Morrison really was. It had changed her approach to every case that came before her, made her more willing to look beyond appearances, more careful about making assumptions based on circumstances. "We never know who we're looking at," she would tell her law clerks. "We never know what stories people carry, what battles they've fought, what sacrifices they've made. The least we can do is treat everyone with the dignity they deserve as human beings." The case file for the People versus James Morrison was officially closed with all charges dismissed, but its impact continued to ripple through the justice system, the veterans community, and the conscience of a nation that had been reminded of its obligation to those who had served. Years later, when Judge Williams retired from the bench, she kept only one case file from her decades of service: Colonel Morrison. It served as a reminder of the day when justice wasn't just about following procedure or enforcing the law, but about recognizing the worth and dignity of every person who stood before the court. The empty chair at the defendant's table where Colonel Morrison had sat that morning had been filled by hundreds of other defendants over the years, each carrying their own stories, their own struggles, their own need for understanding and compassion. And because of what happened on that Tuesday morning when a hero walked into her courtroom disguised as a homeless man, Judge Williams made sure that every person who appeared before her was seen not just as a case number or a legal problem, but as a human being deserving of respect. The lesson of Colonel James Morrison lived on in every hearing, every sentence, every moment when justice was tempered with mercy and recognition that sometimes the people who need our help the most are the ones who look like they deserve it the least. In the end, Colonel Morrison's greatest victory wasn't the Medal of Honor he earned in Vietnam or the recognition he finally received in his twilight years. It was the reminder he provided that honor and heroism can exist in anyone, that dignity persists even in the most difficult circumstances, and that it's never too late to come home. If you believe that every veteran deserves respect regardless of their circumstances, type honor in the comment. If you believe that heroism comes in many forms, hit that subscribe button. And if you know a veteran whose service has gone recognized, share their story, because every hero deserves to be remembered, and every story of service deserves to be told.